I love writing my constitutional blog posts, the ones that deal with the actual Constitution, the Constitution for Dummies. That's definitely one of my favorite and the hardest posts that I write. There's a lot of education that I myself am getting when writing these posts, and I hope that it's giving you guys a lot of education as well. I love writing them for both of those reasons. So I published on Monday, I've been publishing on Monday some older posts that I think are relevant to what I've been talking about and that are just educational. And I published on Monday my blog post on the Preamble. I republished this one a couple times, but it seems to be pretty popular. And it was popular again, which is interesting to me because I'm realizing that more and more people are interested in the very meaty constitutional subjects that I write about and less so in the subjects that deal with even modern day political topics. So that's interesting to me. It's something that I wouldn't expect because it's a lot of kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Academic reading, a lot of more deep, meaty reading, but apparently that's what people want. So I decided, all right, I've been talking a lot about the Supreme Court. I've been talking a lot about mandates and OSHA and the executive order. I've been talking about, arbitrary power. So I've been talking about a lot of these subjects that are very relevant to what we're dealing with today, right now. Now, everything with the Constitution obviously is relevant to today, right now. So I don't want you to think that when I write an article about the Constitution or looking at the Constitution, that's not relevant. But sometimes I'm not necessarily picking out a very specific action in government today. Sometimes I'm just looking at the Constitution. So that's what I decided to do for today's post. I decided to look at a little clause in the Constitution and dig into what it means, what it was supposed to mean, and how it has changed or how the government is no longer following it. The unfortunate reality is almost any portion of the Constitution that I'm pulling out, I'm realizing the government doesn't follow. So I already knew that, I guess, and I'm sure most of you already knew that as well, but it is a little sad to realize. So I'm going to read through this, but I'm going to give you my commentary as I read through it, and hopefully this is enjoyable for you. So the name of my blog post today is The Constitution for Dummies, the Appropriations Clause. Now, I actually didn't know that this clause was called the Appropriations Clause. I've just always thought of it as Article 1, Section 9, and there's a bunch of different sections. But it's called the Appropriations Clause, and that's what I'm going to refer to it as throughout this blog post. So I start out kind of really dealing with the fact that there's a lot of context that we need to address and to look at when considering the Constitution and the way it was written at the time, okay? So many times we look at our American government through our American eyes, never through the lens of history. For instance, it seems obvious to us that the people who represent us in Congress would be the ones to approve and direct the spending of government money, rather than the president approving and directing the spending of money whenever he pleases. And this is something I really try to emphasize to my students a lot, is we think of things today in American terms, right? We obviously think private property is a normal thing that every American knows. Everybody would know private property, for instance. But that's not necessarily true. And in the same way, what I'm saying here is that our government, we're very accustomed to Congress handling most of the most important things that the government does are handled by Congress, I think is what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to articulate. So, but we need to really look at the allocation of power between Congress and the president with a more contextually informed lens, right? We need to understand that the way that our founders broke that power up between the House of Representatives and the Senate and the president was very intentional and with purpose, okay? So we need to look at this allocation of power through the lens of history to grasp its truly unprecedented reality. Historically speaking, what king or emperor wasn't empowered to spend money, right? What about waging war? What about treaties? How could a king wage war or enter into treaties without the ability to spend the money to do so? The idea of taking the power to spend money away from the executive was unprecedented at the time of the American founding. The mere concept that the legislative is the one in charge of all allocation of money, meaning the legislative holds the power over war, over law implementation, over federal agency power, and over every aspect of the funding and spending of government money, is truly unique in world politics, and it really is. Throughout history, kings and emperors always were the ones who waged war, and therefore they were the ones in charge of the purse. That doesn't mean that there were not some exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, the individual who is in charge of the whole government is the one that's also in charge of the money in that government. So our founders were taking a very different approach in our government system. One of the most unique things being that our Congress is the one that declares war, not the president. Therefore, it's also within our Congress's power to fund the war and to allocate all money to whatever the government does in general. So, and yet in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution states this: no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. Now, I want to just mention something about this. In consequence of appropriations made by law, no money shall be drawn. Now, this does not mean that this understanding of Congress's power over money wasn't already known by the time Article 1, Section 9 was written. In other words, if you read Article 1, Section 8, or if you read Article 1, Section 1 through 7, you're going to already know and be aware that Congress is the one who controls the purse strings, right? And this is something that's reiterated many times, and the founders were very careful to make sure that this was the case because they knew that the people had the most direct influence and effect on members of Congress, right? And they wanted to make sure that those we directly hired and have a direct impact on are going to be the ones that control the money we pay them to do the job that they do for us, okay? So this article here, this section, this clause, I guess I should say, that I'm going over is a little bit of a redundant clause in that it's already implied in Articles 1 through 8 that Congress is the one in control of the money, and therefore money can't be spent without the approval of Congress. However, it gets more specific because of this. Appropriations is not necessarily approval to spend. Appropriations is a very specific method of ordering or directing the way money is spent. Okay? So I'm going to keep reading because I think I articulate this in a way that hopefully you'll understand. So in other words, federal money cannot be spent unless it is first attached to a law written by the people who represent the American people. In short, federal spending cannot be arbitrary. So what do I mean by that? I've harped on the importance of arbitrary power, or I've harped on the importance of avoiding arbitrary power in government because arbitrary power is limitless power, right? Power is arbitrary when it's not attached to some outside standard. The power our government possesses comes from the Constitution and is therefore confined. So let's take this a step further. The founders wanted to be sure that money, meaning our money, when spent by the government would be intrinsically attached to and confined by the job description we gave our government. If the government chooses to spend money, it can only do so within the confines of the Constitution. That is to say, all laws written by Congress must fall within the confines of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and no money shall be drawn from the Treasury unless Congress writes a law to support such an appropriation. Therefore, all spending is supposed to be confined and defined by the Constitution. Is this making sense? So this is really important. In other words, when Congress writes a law, there's money attached to that law by default of the fact that when a law is written, something has to be carried out. So there's either an agency that's created or added to. Therefore, there's money that Congress has to allocate in addition to that law to enforce that law. Now, what is being said here is that enforcement or that spending of money cannot be arbitrary. Congress does not write a law and then hand money to the executive branch and say, do what you want with it. Congress is actually empowered specifically by the Constitution to not only say, Congress, you have a law that you must enforce the way we said to enforce it, but when we give you this money, we're going to tell you exactly how we want you to spend this money. And you cannot spend this money until we have approved through law that this is how we want you to spend it. Okay? So how it works. In fact, the reality that only Congress can appropriate funds is a given, and I already said this, without Article 1, Section 9 confirming it. Kate Smith, a professor of law at Yale Law School, puts it this way, and I'm going to be referencing her a good bit through this article because I think she breaks this down really well, and she has informed me as well on how this appropriation clause works. So this is what she says. The Appropriations Clause is not technically a grant of legislative power because pursuant, and pursuant just means as a result of, the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Congress clearly has the power to specify the objects, amounts, and timing of federal spending. Notice that. Objects, amounts, and timing. Okay, so this is very specific directives given and attached to money when being spent by the executive branch. Okay, this is appropriation. This is not just, here's money. So let me reread that. Congress clearly has the power to specify the objects, amounts, and timing of federal spending, even if there were no appropriations clause. Get that? No, even if there were no appropriations clause, Congress clearly already has this power. If Congress could not limit the executive's withdrawing of funds from the Treasury, then the constitutional grants of power to Congress to raise taxes, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and to borrow money, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2, would be for naught because the executive could effectively compel taxing and borrowing by spending at will. Rather, the Appropriations Clause creates a legislative duty that Congress, so this is a duty for Congress to take and to cherish, that Congress exercise control and assume responsibility over the federal fiscal budget. Congress's power of the purse, and I added budget in there. Congress's power of the purse is at the foundation of our Constitution's separation of powers, a constitutionally mandated check on executive power. The creators of the American government wanted to make sure that there was an appropriate legislative check on how the executive spent money in the enforcement of law. In other words, it shouldn't be arbitrary. This is critical because the people have the most direct connection and influence on Congress. Outside of Congress, only 2 people in the U.S. government are elected. That's crazy, and I don't think a lot of us get that or appreciate the immensity of that very often. So out of the millions of government federal workers, staffers, employees, judges, ambassadors, and the like, only Congress, the president, and the vice president are directly connected to the people. It's so imperative that Congress have a say over how federal money is spent that many executive powers are useless unless Congress chooses to fund them. And this again is a quote from Smith. Smith says, moreover, despite the categorical imperative of the Appropriations Clause, it would seem that Congress itself is constitutionally obligated to provide funding necessary for the president to undertake executive powers specifically granted in Article 2. For instance, to receive ambassadors, act as commander-in-chief, negotiate treaties, grant pardons, and the like. If Congress fails to provide necessary funds, then the grants of power to the president are themselves for naught. When I read this, I'm going to be honest, that blew me away. I mean, I've studied the Constitution a lot, but I hadn't really greatly appreciated the power that our founders gave to Congress, especially when it comes to counteracting the power of the executive. The reality is that if Congress does not fund or choose to support these executive powers like receiving ambassadors, being the commander-in-chief, treaties, pardons, all of those things, if Congress does not back that up with some sort of financial support, the president really has no effective use of his power. I hope that blows your mind just as much as it blows mine. We have been so kind of ingrained in this, at least since I've been alive, okay, which is not a ton of time, but it is a decent amount of time, right? And since I've been alive, it has been ingrained in me that the president is the power to be. He is the zenith of power. And I've noticed that with all of my students. I noticed that tendency in thought for people I speak with. We tend to look to the executive as the source of all power, when in fact, the branch that holds the majority of power is the legislative branch. So much so that the executive's power is dependent on the power of the legislative to actually functionally work. So what is an appropriation? An appropriation defined by Smith is this: it must specify the powers, activities, and purposes, what we may call simply objects, for which the funds may be used. End quote. Appropriations are not merely congressional directives about how much money these executive agencies or president may spend, but also directives about the powers attached to them, the activities attached, and the purposes attached. Merely writing a law and creating a federal agency to enforce that law does not authorize the agency to enforce the law or spend the funds. We'll rewind that. I just added to that. So merely writing a law and creating a federal agency to enforce the law does not authorize that agency to spend the funds. The funds must be appropriated by Congress. Again, the spending of money must be attached to an outside standard. It cannot be arbitrary. So federal funds cannot be spent by the executive branch arbitrarily. They can't just do what they want with the funds. They must do it within the limitations, again, not arbitrary, the limitations of the laws attached to them and the specific directives within those laws about how to spend the funds. Spending with no limitation or standard is simply too much power to give to the executive. So here comes the big question. Does government follow Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7? The question then is this: does our government follow this constitutional directive? No. Surprise. Through what some call backdoor spending, Congress has given discretionary, and discretionary just means that Congress has the discretion over the way they use, the executive has discretion over the way they use this power. So Congress has given discretionary spending authority to many agencies in the executive branch. For example, the Federal Reserve has total and complete authority over how it allocates and spends federal funds, with no congressional oversight. Other congressional laws have, this is a quote again by Smith, indefinitely authorized federal agencies to spend Treasury funds or special purpose taxes, fees, or forfeitures without separate appropriations of such funds. These have no limitations on amount or duration, although they may spend on some specific object. In other words, Congress might give some sort of, Congress may give the executive branch an order about where they're supposed to spend the money. In other words, it's supposed to be for this specific topic or object, but the amount of money that they're to spend on that object or the length of time that they're supposed to spend the money on that object is not directed by Congress, even though that is something that is supposed to be a part of appropriation. For example, spending on the national debt, entitlement programs such as Social Security, unemployment payments, and the like are, quote by Smith, likewise usually funded by an indefinite and permanent appropriation in the statute creating the program itself. Smith further explains, there is, for instance, an indefinite permanent appropriation for national intelligence activities, the objects of which are only partially specified in federal statutes. One questionable form of spending authority is open-ended authority to receive and spend donations and gifts, even gifts conditioned for a particular purpose, which Congress has granted to a variety of federal agencies, including the State Department. Loan guarantees and insurance schemes like mortgages backed by the Federal Home Loan Banks similarly function outside the appropriations process, notwithstanding the federal financial liability incurred. That's a lot. I'm going to keep reading and then I'll discuss. Further, the Constitution in Article 1, Section 9 stipulates that, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. In other words, this is a direct quote from the Constitution. Not only is Congress supposed to appropriate any funds that it is going to spend or that the executive is going to spend by law, but there needs to be a record, a public record from time to time that's published showing the public what Congress and the executive branches and agencies are spending the money on. In order for us to keep them accountable to what they're doing, what the money is being spent on, we need to make sure that there's some sort of register or receipts to show us from time to time what's being spent and what it's being spent on. Okay? So Smith says this. Since the founding era, Congress has largely delegated its duty under the Statement and Accounts Clause. The Statement and Accounts Clause is the clause I just discussed, to executive branch agencies such as the Treasury Department and later the Office of Management and Budget. This is where it gets interesting. These or those agencies in turn, and in some cases by statutory mandate, that means by law, sometimes Congress does this by law, have failed to include or report in full on a variety of backdoor federal spending programs, federal insurance liabilities, and spending and borrowing by semi-autonomous federal entities. Certain national security spending is also excluded, surprise, is also excluded from the annual budget process, while the Congressional Budget Office and Government Accountability Office seek to provide further budget accountability as agents of the legislative branch. The Statement and Accounts Clause has de facto fallen in the purview of the executive. So think of it this way. Part of the reason that federal agencies who are full of federal workers, none of them accountable to us directly, because none of them are elected directly by us, the reason they've had an immense amount of discretionary spending authority over the past 100 years is this. Congress, who we have elected, has chosen to give this power to these agencies. So, yes, Congress has given these agencies an immense amount of arbitrary power. Not only are many of the congressional laws written unconstitutional, but there isn't even a direct line attaching the implementation and enforcement of that law to at least stay within the confines of the law itself. In other words, it's arbitrary power built on arbitrary power. Think about it. So we have Congress writing unconstitutional laws, but we would hope that at least within those unconstitutional laws, there are direct limitations on the power of the executive branch enforcing these unconstitutional laws. In other words, hopefully, there are specific objects, durations, and time given to the executive branch telling them, hey, the money that you have, you must spend on very specific objects for a very specific amount of time, and this is how much you can spend. When in fact, Congress has started to give away the power to make this decision given to them in Article 1, Section 9, to the executive branch, saying that the executive branch can essentially do whatever they want with the money that they have been allocated, not even appropriated at this point. And the only thing they must follow is this vague unconstitutional law. So the spending of the money is arbitrary and not even attached to the arbitrary law itself. So we have arbitrary power built on arbitrary power. Think about Social Security. Social Security is confined by nothing. It is essentially mandatory spending, which is a statute that firmly established that Social Security money must be spent by law. It is required by law that this money must be given to someone when they reach a certain age. Welfare spending is by law established that it must be spent when someone reaches a certain level of poverty. These are not even things that are up for debate anymore. These are not even things discussed in the discretionary budget anymore. And when I say discretionary budget, I mean the budget that is actually debated and discussed during the fiscal year is not even looking at maybe 10, 15% of what is actually spent by our federal government on an annual basis. The majority of what our government spends on an annual basis is what we call mandatory spending. It is spending that is not really even accounted for. It is a law was written, and now the federal government is by law required to have this money spent. And these agencies are given full discretion over how most of this money is spent. The national intelligence, the whole arena of national intelligence, is able to spend and operate very free of congressional oversight. This is a remarkably troubling reality, something that I've known theoretically, but reading and studying this today has been very eye-opening for me, and I hope it's as eye-opening for you as it is for me. So I'm going to finish my article with how I finished my article. So need I remind you who employs the federal government, who pays the federal government? We the people do. And we have an obligation to be effective, informed employers who do the following. 1, we need to know what our employee's job description says. That's the Constitution. 2, we need to make sure that those we elect know that we know what their job description says. 3, we need to hold those elected employees accountable to that job description and punish them accordingly if they do not follow it. Otherwise, sections of the Constitution, like the Appropriations Clause, become nice suggestions with very literally no power.